This video is brought to you by Ground News. Earlier this week, the Alliance of Democracies published the Democracy Perception Index, the world's largest annual study on how people perceive democracy, with over 110,000 respondents across 100 countries. There were lots of interesting findings in there, but the one that grabbed the most headlines is that America's global appeal has declined sharply, and for the first time ever, China is more popular than the US, internationally speaking. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the decline of America's global appeal, what you might call its soft power, what's driving it, and whether it really matters. If you're interested in the political alliances and groupings which shape our world, then you might enjoy our poster, Every Alliance Explained. It shows, in slightly confusing detail, all of the world's major alliances and how different countries link together. Check out the poster by clicking the link in. So let's just start by looking at the relevant data. In that report we mentioned in the intro, respondents across a number of countries were asked to say whether or not they viewed certain other countries positively or negatively to create a net approval score. On this metric, the most popular countries in the world at the moment are Switzerland, Singapore, Qatar, Canada and Japan. Most countries enjoy a net positive approval rating. That is, more people across the world see them positively rather than negatively. But a handful of countries have a net negative approval rating. Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Argentina all have a slightly negative rating of -1. Russia, Iraq and Hungary all have a net negative rating of around -10, and Belarus, Israel and Iran all have net negative ratings of over -20, making them the least popular countries in the world. Anyway, what makes this list particularly interesting is that, for the first time ever, the US also registered a net negative approval rating, coming in at -5. Not only is this the US's lowest score ever, it also puts the US well below its superpower rival, China, which currently enjoys a net approval rating of +14. Furthermore, the vast majority of countries surveyed view China more positively than the US. Interestingly, other democracies, who have historically been pretty friendly towards the US, are now more likely to view the US negatively, while authoritarian regimes generally view America more favourably. There's also a stark geographic divide. America is viewed overwhelmingly negatively in Europe and the Middle East, but overwhelmingly positively in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a remarkable reversal. Since at least the 2010s, international opinion towards China has been generally pretty negative, while the US has historically been one of the more positively perceived countries on the world stage. Only last year, the same poll gave the US a net approval rating of +22, well above China on +5. Other surveys have found similar things recently. An Ipsos poll carried out earlier this year across 29 countries, for instance, found that only 46% of respondents thought the US would have an overall positive influence on world affairs, the lowest score ever recorded, and down from 59%, who said the same in October of last year, with declines in 26 of the 29 countries surveyed, and especially steep declines in Canada, South Korea, and Europe. So, what's going on? Well, obviously some of this is down to Trump, who's uniquely unpopular internationally. According to the Democracy Perceptions Index, Trump's international net approval rating stands at -30, behind not only Xi, who enjoys a net approval rating of +2, but even Russian President Vladimir Putin, who sits at -17. This would also explain why America's image has been the worst damaged in Europe. After all, Trump has been far less friendly to Europe than Biden was, threatening to invade Greenland/Denmark, abandoning Ukraine, and frequently attacking what he sees as Europe's unfair trade practices. This speaks to the stark regional disparities at play here. Trump is super unpopular in Europe and the Middle East, but enjoys a net positive approval rating in sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, Xi is pretty unpopular in Europe, but very popular in both the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. However, while Trump might have accelerated things, America's global standing has been trending downwards for some time now. America's global image obviously suffered in Trump's first term, although not quite as much as it is right now. And while there was somewhat of a recovery under Biden, global opinion towards the US still soured towards the end of his term, and never returned to the heady highs we saw under Obama. This is for a variety of reasons, but perhaps fundamentally because constant political dysfunction means America is no longer seen as the beacon of democracy it once was. We're not trying to have a go at the US here, by the way. Americans themselves broadly agree with this sentiment, and their faith in all America's major institutions, especially Congress, has been declining for the past few decades. Interestingly, that Ipsos poll we mentioned a second ago also found that 63% of Americans thought the US would have a positive influence on the world, the lowest figure ever recorded by quite some margin, and a testament to the lack of faith many Americans currently have in their own country. So, on to the last part of this video. Does this decline in America's global reputation actually matter? Well, there are sort of two competing schools of thought here. On the one hand, you've got politicians like Trump, who seem to think that soft power, often defined as the ability to co-opt rather than coerce, doesn't really matter as long as you've still got hard power. In other words, the ability to force other countries into doing what you want via, say, tariffs or military action. Trump and co would argue that previous administrations overestimated the efficacy of America's soft power, and, in failing to convince other countries to do America's bidding, allowed the US to get ripped off, to use Trump's preferred turn of phrase. Advocates of soft power, on the other hand, would argue that soft power not only brings intangible benefits, but also that it reinforces hard power in certain ways. Soft power is what allows countries to attract the world's best and brightest, as the US has done historically. This has been great for the US, and high-skilled immigration has both driven America's impressive economic growth and helped offset the demographic pressures afflicting most developed countries. How other people see the US also affects what sort of governments they elect, and the decline in America's global standing will make them more likely to elect governments willing to resist American coercion. We've already seen this in both Canada and Australia, where more left-wing candidates who promised to take a stronger stance against Trump triumphed in the polls. Advocates of soft power would also probably argue that the decline in America's global image matters more now that it's been accompanied by a rise in China's global popularity. For anyone who's worried about America being usurped by a rising China, and this is pretty much a bipartisan anxiety in Washington at the moment, the fact that global opinion is turning towards Beijing should be a cause for concern, especially given Trump is currently trying to force countries to choose between the two superpowers. This is a complex and nuanced story though, and as such there's plenty more to read about this online, with 7 sources reporting on it. The issue is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't hugely biased? Well, that's a problem we face when making these videos too. And luckily, that's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified that there are at least 1 left-leaning and 2 more centrist sources reporting on it. In fact, in addition to this, they've also shown the main differences in headlines among left-leaning and right-leaning outlets, with more left-leaning outlets focusing on the decline in America's global standing, and more centrist outlets paying more attention to the rise in popularity seen by both Russia and China. We're able to do that because of our sponsor, Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. This is all in addition to the biased distribution we mentioned earlier, and together these fantastic features help you to figure out exactly who's behind the stories you're reading and what agenda they may have. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.